Hello, I'm Bruce DuPoint. Coming up, where we are and where we're headed when it comes to the region's transportation network. Today on News Talk, a discussion with a man who's been at the center of the roads and rails discussion and debate in Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. for more than 2 decades. Lon Anderson of AAA, our road scholar, headed into retirement, but not before one more conversation with us, your calls included. Then, the Nationals add a closer with significant postseason experience, but at what cost to clubhouse harmony? We'll talk with Tom Threlkeld about the acquisition of relief pitcher Jonathan Papelbon. Also, training camp opens across the NFL. For the Burgundy and Gold, a chance to show that second-year coach Jay Gruden and GM Scott McCloughan have their team on the right path.
From News Channel 8, this is News Talk with Bruce DuPoint.
Hello and welcome in. Good to have you with us today. For more than 2 decades, our first guest has found himself at the heart of the region's discussions about transportation. Whether the topic was tolls or new roads or the balance between cars and transit, Lon Anderson was in the mix in government settings where discussions get made and in the media where we discuss public affairs. Lon is stepping down from his post as head of governmental and media affairs for AAA. He's retiring, but not before one more go in the News Talk hot seat. Welcome back.
Thank you, Bruce. It seems appropriate. I think my last media interview is with you.
Perfect. I'm delighted and honored. And you and I go back 20 years, so yeah. It's really, we've had a lot of fun over the years.
We have.
Great to have you here. I have to ask the most important question first. Your wardrobe has improved over the years, but you are no John Townsend. Is it true that you're retiring? Because let's face it, when it comes to no one sets the bar higher than John Townsend, your colleague at AAA. Is this the reason?
Well, there's been a real benefit, and you're right. I can't compete with his wardrobe, and every time my wife says, "Lon, you're a clothes horse," I say, "Wait a minute,
honey,
have you watched John? And he works for me. Come on."
You have been. It's really great to have you here today because this region has grown. We have seen so many transportation challenges, and whether it's in Richmond, whether it's in the city, whether it's in Annapolis, whether it's in the counties around this area, even some of the national issues, you've been right there. And I guess primarily, is it fair to say you've viewed yourself as the motorist's advocate?
Well, that's right. I just feel so very fortunate because AAA has, part of what it's done for its 100+ years is be an advocate for motorists. So I've been given a job to go after whatever I thought was important to motorists in our region, and I have tried to do that. And fortunately or unfortunately, our politicians in the region seem to lead with their chin quite a bit in transportation issues, and certainly I've been there to call them on it.
They always talk a good game, it seems, but they don't always deliver. Is that true, and is that the number one frustration?
It is. When I came in 21 years ago, we were discussing the fact that we had some of the very worst congestion in the United States. And as I'm leaving AAA, we are still discussing that in the Washington metropolitan area, depending on various things, we're worst in the nation, second worst or third worst. But Texas Transportation Institute and many others validate that year after year. It's disappointing to me that in 2 decades we have not been able to look at the importance of transportation. And I'm not just talking about roads, because the roads work well when mass transit works well, and vice versa. If they both work well, then we're more mobile, and we need both to work well.
Even in places that have a good reputation for planning and places that regard themselves to be toward the top of the pack when it comes to planned and thoughtful development, you're supposed to have capacity that comes alongside the growth. It seems, though, that and I'm thinking of Montgomery County, which is where I got my start and where you and I first met. But even in places like Montgomery County, the development always comes, but the supporting infrastructure may or may not.
And often
Why is that?
Well, often they will approve the growth based upon the roads that are supposed to be built. We've got to remember that, in Maryland, for example, in the Washington metropolitan area, we originally started off with a plan for growth that included 3 beltways. There was an inner loop, a middle loop, and an outer loop. And what we did was we erased the 2, built 1, and then went ahead and did the development that was designed, that was supposed to rely on about 3 beltways. So we have put ourselves in a really bad situation, and as a result, we have not kept pace. We have erased so many roads that were supposed to be built over the years, and in addition, we've not done a very good job keeping pace with mass transit.
Why? Why is it that, and I'm going to guess that what you could call NIMBYism, but local concern, let's phrase it that way, local concern has always been a big factor, and the lack of or unwillingness to raise the funding. Those are the kind of the 2 pillars?
Money and politics. I mean, I think the Inter-County Connector is a good example, for example. It was very, very controversial. And every meeting you went to for 15 years, and I went to meetings for at least that long about the ICC, and you would think that there was no one in favor of building the ICC. But every poll we did showed that opposition was somewhere around 15%, and favorability ranged anywhere from the high 50s to 75%. So there was an overwhelming public approval of the Inter-County Connector, but we had this small but extremely vocal and effective opposition that effectively delayed the building of it 10, 15 years.
Was it a mistake to build the ICC as a toll road? I mean, there's no time of day that you can get on the ICC without having to pay something. At off hours, it's not that much. But they built that as a toll highway.
They did, but that was the only way they had the money to build it, because as you remember, unfortunately, this goes back to funding. It was, I think, 1992 or 1993 was the last time Maryland increased the fuel taxes to significantly increase their transportation funding. And of course, they once again did it in 2013, but that was a huge gap. A lot of stuff happened between 93 and 2013.
But it seems underused now, so to the extent that it's helping people reach their destination more quickly, using less fuel, spending less time, and getting them off other roads that have more traffic than they were built for, or than they can really handle. It's not delivering its promise.
In a perfect world, we wouldn't have to build the ICC as a toll road. We wouldn't have to build the express lanes as toll roads on 495 and 95. These actually should be public roads. Improvements to the Beltway and 95 should have been built by VDOT and should have been free. The reality is, there's not money in the public coffers to do those improvements. In fact, I remember a conversation I had with Pierce Homer, then Secretary of Transportation of Virginia, and we opposed the hot lanes, the express lanes on the Beltway. And he said, Lon, I thought you wanted to do something to alleviate congestion on the Beltway. We don't have the money in Virginia's coffers to do it. If this is going to be done in your lifetime, it's going to have to be done with private money, a public-private partnership, and that means it's going to have to be tolled, period. So if you want to do something for your members and for motorists and mobility in Virginia, shut up with your complaints about that and support us.
But that is not how the federal highway system came about, which has been heralded as one of the great moments of progress for this nation. Not to say that everything has to be done in cookie-cutter fashion as it was done the time before, but it is something we can point to as a sort of shared benefit with shared expense. It doesn't have to be this sort of Lexus Lane notion.
Absolutely.
So I can't help but wonder, when you say we can't, is it really that we can't, or just that we choose not to?
We choose not to. It's really interesting. Why is it that in our society we have so devalued transportation? Transportation is at the heart of our economy. It moves people to jobs. It moves people to market. It moves goods to market. Without transportation, our modern society doesn't function at all. And yet, we are allowing it to deteriorate. I remember I was at the grand opening of when Spiro Agnew put the shovel in the ground, breaking ground for Metro, and when it first opened, it was a model for the nation, and it was for about a decade. But then we underfunded. We chronically underfunded it, and now we've had fatal crashes. Now it's just as chronically a problem, and that is telling. Why is it that we talk about how very, very important a vital mass transit system is in this region, but we can't come up with the dollars to fund it?
So we have about a minute left for this segment. You meet with elected leaders privately and with staff.
Yes.
You know, and they know that you know that they say one thing and do another. Are you able to get from them, and I know it's tough to generalize, I'm using them when we're talking about hundreds of different individuals, but to the extent that you ever get some truths behind closed doors that we don't get out in the public realm, why the disconnect?
They will blame it on many things. I mean, I think if you take a look at the two governors that we have right now, and Terry McCullough and Larry Hogan, they are both, I think, much more pro-transportation. But ultimately, it takes dollars, and that means getting gas prices or fuel prices increased through the legislature. And the legislature's flat out refused for 20 years to increase. Same thing, but same thing about the federal legislature. Even now, they can't agree on a robust transportation appropriation.
It seems like the best we're going to get is a 3-month extension. Who budgets in 3-month increments?
Isn't that disgraceful? I mean, that's just downright disgraceful. They should be called out for it.
Talking with Lon Anderson of AAA. A break here. Back, though, with much more news talk for our Thursday right after this. Continuing our conversation here on News Talk with Lon Anderson, who is stepping down this week after 20 years at AAA. This, best to our knowledge, his final interview before he and the missus head to their retirement villa in wild and wonderful West Virginia.
Exactly.
Phone lines open as we continue to talk with Lon. If you have a question, I'd be curious to know what's the bottleneck or transportation failing of this region that bothers you the most and causes you to wonder, where are our elected leaders when it comes to solving problems that just cry out for a fix? 703-387-1020 is the number. Whatever you want to discuss with Lon Anderson of AAA, we'll go to the phones as your calls come in. Those of you watching in the 10 a.m. hour, that's when we're able to take calls. I hope you'll join us if you can. Grab the phone now. 703-387-1020 is our number. You have squared off over time with folks from the smart growth community, let's say, advocates of smart growth, who say that it's unsustainable and unwise to always be building out, knocking down trees and taking over farmland and highway as far as the eye can see, because we'll never get caught up. We'll never build enough roads for all that sprawl. Have you come to see some aspects of that theory?
Well, I have, but I also really challenge them because they have a very narrow platform. It's no roads. And you've heard Stuart Schwartz and others say we should not be spending any more money on roads. Well, that's kind of interesting, but I think you've got to look at the big picture in transportation. The big picture in transportation is still, in this region, about 95% of all trips are still on roads. So, if you're going to improve that 5%, that's good for 5%. But there's still that 95%. Now, I'm not talking about commuter trips. I'm talking about all trips. And, of course, we have a much higher percentage of commuter trips that include mass transit into the city, as it should be. But the fact is that we have, and I think will continue to have, a major need for roads. And where we can find additional capacity and fit it, we should. But, it seems like every bit of growth out there, they say, well, that's sprawl. But, I mean, is it sprawl when Montgomery County authorizes a new a new development in Germantown or Gaithersburg or whatever that's been on the master plan for 20 or 30 years. Nobody regulates their land more tightly than Montgomery County, Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
And 270 was their growth corridor. So no surprise that we continue to grow out there. Is that sprawl? I don't know, but it's master plan growth. So, you know, I do think that we do have to do a better job in all aspects. We need to facilitate walking. We need to facilitate biking. We need to facilitate more mass transit. That's why we have been a very active promoter of the Purple Line.
And density at metro stations.
And density at metro stations, absolutely. Absolutely. We can grow smarter, and we should grow smarter. But growing smarter is only a part of the picture.
You and I remember, and many of the people watching and listening to us now remember a generation ago when 270 got blown up in a construction sense, of course.
Yeah.
And they built what is now there with the CD lanes, which were sort of an innovation and much more capacity. I mean, 270 wasn't much until about 20 years ago when they endeavored to create what we have today. What is the state of 270 today, as you look at the need relative to the capacity?
After a couple of decades of neglect, it's pathetic. It's terrible. I mean, it's an example of why we have some of the worst congestion in the United States. Just look at 270 and the split any rush hour. And I'm very happy to report that I've had a couple of very good meetings with Maryland Secretary Pete Rahn, Transportation Secretary, and he and the governor have both indicated that fixing 270 is very high on their agenda. And that's great because that was a message that was missing for 8 years in the O'Malley administration.
So where it goes down to the final 2 lanes north of Montgomery Village, is that the primary area that cries out?
Well, that is one. Certainly what we do between Germantown and Frederick is very important because that starts the backup, but also how it blends into the Beltway when people are coming south is also very important. There's hardly an area on 270 that's really properly functional. And they have promised to do both some short-term and long-term fixes. And I think that's great. And the other real sore place, I think, in our region is I-66. And, of course, we know that Virginia has made a huge commitment to repair I-66. You know, I have been saying for years that commuters in the Washington metropolitan area have their Berlin Wall. You know, President Reagan could go to Berlin and say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. But for motorists inbound on I-66 every morning, they have a Berlin Wall, and it's at the Capitol Beltway where unless they have a carpool, they have to exit. Now, on any given day, that only means a backup of 2, 3, 5, or 10 miles, depending on weather and the number of fender benders.
The last time I made the mistake of trying to get on I-95 south and head down to the Outer Banks on a Saturday, I was blown away by how bad I-95 is. It took half a day to get out of Northern Virginia. We had an 8-hour trip ahead of us when we started, and we had 8 hours left when we got to Spotsylvania. We had spent the whole day in the car up to that point. What is the deal with I-95?
Well, the deal with I-95 is just that there is too much traffic. We've not kept pace, and Virginia didn't have the money. I mean, we got to remember, while they had not had a increase on fuel taxes to fund their transportation since 1986. 1986. And they did, of course, increase transportation funding significantly in 2013. But that's quite a span, you know. And what needed to be done was not being done. Period. And I think I-95 may be the most unreliable. It's better now that we've got express lanes part of the way. But you know, my mother lived in Richmond, so I was doing the D.C.-Richmond run very, very regularly, and it was horrible.
Did you ever think you would see a time when parks officials would be forced to close 2 lanes of the Memorial Bridge, 1 in each direction, because the thing is crumbling and we have no money?
Well, You know, I think I'm not surprised, and that's the disappointment. But we've got to remember, the only thing that got us a new Woodrow Wilson Bridge and ended one of our biggest bottlenecks in the region was the fact that it was about to fall in. And you remember, we got all the tours underneath the girders and saw all the rust and everything. And that's what it took to have TV cameras pointed up at the rusty girders that were crumbling to get us a new one. I wish the Park Service had maybe done that demo on Memorial Bridge. But think of it. We've now limited buses. Do you know of any tourists that might want to travel between Arlington and the Lincoln Memorial? Oh, my God.
Great idea, now that you mention it.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, unfortunately, of all of the roads that are poorly funded, probably the Park Service's roads are the worst. I mean, and you've got to think about how vital those roads are, whether it's the GW Parkway, the Baltimore-Washington Parkway, the Suitland Parkway, Rock Creek Parkway. We depend on those parkways. And the Park Service, tell you, they're good at running parks, but they don't get much money for roads.
So we've spent 20-odd minutes bashing our leaders, and I think with justification. But there's a role, it seems, for the media and the public to step up as well. I mean, leaders only do what we, in essence, force them to do.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're in a crisis environment in part because we're not holding people accountable. We're not saying, you must do these things that, by the way, are a win-win. When proper infrastructure maintenance is good for jobs and good for the economy and good in just about every way you can think of, and yet they still won't get us there. I mean, we've just got to up our game until we get what we absolutely need.
Think of that contradiction. You just said leaders, and they won't do anything until they're pushed.
Right.
That's an oxymoron. I mean, it's a contradiction. They should be leading and saying, you know, transportation is good for the economy. It's, you know, without infrastructure, where the hell can we go? And the answer is nowhere. And, you know, is not the health of our economy and our ability to compete with the rising economies of China, for example, which is putting 12% of its GDP into transportation. And we're not even putting 2% into transportation. Wake up, America. And you're right. If all of the people who are sick and tired of sitting in gridlock aired their frustration to their elected leaders, we would get some action. So I would hope that maybe we could join together and at the ballot box let the leaders know this gridlock we have doesn't have to be. It comes out of conscious funding decisions to not put the money there to fix them.
You're going to drive your wife crazy in retirement.
Yeah, probably so. I'd say that's a possibility.
I hope you'll come back and talk with us again. I'm sure you'll be back in the area from time to time. I hope you'll swing by. Bruce. Good luck, and it's been great being able to talk about these issues with you over all these years. Lon
Always
Anderson, departing his post at AAA after more than 20 years. Good to have you with us. Thanks very much for your time, as always. We'll get you caught up on the hour's top stories in the forecast straight ahead, and then what the addition of a top reliever means for the Nationals' hope of a deep run into the postseason.